Good morning, everyone. Bonjour à tous. I'm Aliénor Rougeau, Climate and Energy Program Manager at Environmental Defense Canada. Thanks so much for being here. So today, our panel will provide a briefing about the tar sands tailings ponds. We will address both the current threats posed by the tailings to biodiversity and to Indigenous communities, and we will introduce you to a new regulatory change which presents an immense risk to the area. This briefing will be in English, but some of us are available in French after for comments. So, what are the tar sands tailings ponds? The tar sands are located in northern Alberta, in Canada, in the boreal forest. They have become a highly industrialized site due to oil extraction. Tailings ponds are in fact huge lakes that store the toxic waste of the oil industry. They are located on the shores of the Athabasca River. The river flows north into the Peace Athabasca Delta, one of the largest freshwater deltas in the world. And eventually, it actually drains into the Arctic. The tailings ponds are created because producing oil in the tar sands demands huge amount of water to separate the oil from the sands. Oil producers take large quantities of water from the river, add chemicals, and at the end of their extraction process are left over with large quantities of very toxic fluids, which they store in open pits, the tailings ponds. Now, the oil companies produce enormous amount of this toxic waste. The tailings currently contain about 1.6 trillion liters of toxic fluid. And the physical footprint that they now have over the boreal forest is immense and has been really rapidly growing. To give you an idea, in 1975, which wasn't that long ago, the tailings took about this much right here. Now, that looks tiny, but that's already 300 soccer fields, and that's about 2.4 square kilometers. Fast forward to 2020, the tailings illustrated here were covering up this much. This is over 300 square kilometer of boreal forest, enough to cover the city of Paris 3 times over. Now, actually, we did a bit of the mapping for you. We're currently in Montreal, and if we placed all the tailings together above the island of Montreal, it would be enough to cover most of the island. If you look carefully, just one pond is enough to cover what you and I consider to be downtown Montreal. So, apart from this immense physical footprint, the tailings actually disrupt the ecosystems in more ways. They are acutely toxic. They contain heavy metals and toxic organic compounds, and my colleagues will go into more details about this after. They've also been proven to leak this toxic fluid into the groundwater, and this was confirmed by the Commission for Environmental Cooperation. The leak is at the scale of millions of liters per day. So the size, the growth, and the seepage of the tailings causes immense harm to biodiversity, and industry and government have done really little to address this. But we are now facing a new development which is increasingly concerning. At the request of oil companies, the Canadian government is developing regulations that could allow the release of partially treated tailings into the Athabasca River. So to be specific, Canada is looking at changing its Fisheries Act, which currently prohibits the deposit of deleterious substances into water with fish. And the change would allow oil companies to have a special authorization to release the content of their tailings after a treatment. My colleagues will lay out our concerns with regards to the proposal, which in our opinion puts human health and ecological health at great risk and also isn't in itself a long-term solution to the issue of tailings. So I will now pass it to Melody Lepine from Mikisew Cree First Nation, which is one of the Indigenous nations downstream of the oil sands.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Melody Lepine, and I'm a member of the Mikisew Cree First Nation, directly downstream of the Athabasca oil sands. My title is the Director for Government and Industry Relations. So for the last 2 decades, I've been working with industry and with government, managing all of the consultation and engagement. I just want to start off by saying that I have reviewed numerous environmental impact assessments for those last 2 decades, intervened and participated in numerous regulatory joint federal and provincial hearings, and not once has my community heard that tailings was a problem. We have intervened, voicing concerns about the growth and management of these tailings, and here we are somewhat 40-something years later with only one option forced upon us, and that is to now treat and release these massive tailings ponds. My region represents the highest concentration of dams with a high consequence of failure rating in Alberta. The legacy operators, those that have been there for several decades, say they've reached holding capacity. Therefore, they are pushing for authorization for the release of these traded tailings effluent into the Athabasca River, which again is upstream from my community. I just want to describe my community and some of the concerns that have been voiced since, I would say, before 2003, our first intervention. Health concerns, high rates of autoimmune diseases and high rates of cancer, particularly one in particular, which my community faces, is this bile duct cancer. So never has there been a baseline health study to examine what is changing the health of my community. A large risk is that the operators have a poor plan for this reclamation of tailings as they leave the region. What terrifies me and the community is that Alberta does not have enough money. In fact, less than 3% set aside in their mine financial security program to ensure there is enough to clean up this toxic mess. These uncertainties have existed for decades. Now somehow it is becoming our problem to deal with. We do not know what the health impacts of all of this will be, the impacts on our rights as Indigenous communities. We are already telling Canada that our downstream World Heritage Site, Wood Buffalo National Park, is in danger. And yet Canada is considering this treat and release as a viable option. They want to create a policy to allow this to happen. How does this fit with Canada's messages these past few weeks? Their vision for nature-based solutions, their vision for Indigenous-led conservation in protected areas, especially within a fragile ecosystem such as the downstream Peace Athabasca Delta. Thank you for your time this morning.
Miigwech Melody. Mnogishep, Nugonsekwe, Indigenous Cause, Wabshishi and Dodam, Chimnising and Donchaba, Anishinaabe Kwe, Potawatomi and Dow. My name is Tori Kress. I am the Communications Manager with Keepers of the Water. Keepers of the Water is a First Nations, Métis, Inuit, environmental groups, concerned citizens, and communities working together for protection of water, air, land, and all living things within the Arctic Ocean drainage basin. We're here to raise our voices during these international conversations on biodiversity. Keepers of the Water is an Indigenous women's-led organization. Our teachings help us understand the connection women have with water. No matter who you are, each of us is born from the water before we ever breathe our first breath of air. We want to remind the world that the government and industry in the settler state of Canada do not have free, prior, informed consent from Indigenous peoples to create Fisheries Act regulations that will allow for the dumping of toxic tailings into the Athabasca River. It is our position that there is absolutely no release of so-called treated tailings into the watershed. Water knows no man-made boundaries. Our power is rooted in the traditional ecological knowledge or Indigenous science that comes from a millennia of observations and storytelling in our traditional territories. We are the first scientists of this land. Keepers is opposed to the tailings release in any form. We feel that if water can be cleaned for release, then it should be good enough to be reused within mining practices. There has been enough water wasted in these mining practices that have created vast lakes of wastewater you can actually see from outer space. So first of all, let's stop calling them tailings ponds. Keepers of the Water co-chair Jean Lomcourt couldn't be with us today, but she is definitely bringing her message through me. Jean Lomcourt comes directly from the community Fort McKay First Nation, which is located near Suncor and several tailings ponds. Last week, the Keepers of the Water and the Indigenous Wisdom and Knowledge Center hosted the Water is Life Legal Summit in Treaty 6 territory, where Jean shared a bit of her story with us. She lives in the destruction that was left on the landscape from mining oil sands and displaced from her family trap line. She said to us, "There's prophecies that have been told by our ancestors saying that we're going to have a war on water. I'm ready for that war. I will be there to make my voice heard. And if I have to be there physically, it is something that is worth fighting for because it's our life that we're fighting for." So Chimigwech to Jean for continuing to fight and stand up and share these stories. Miigwech. Paul?
Thanks, Tori. My name is Paul Belanger. I am science lead for Keepers of the Water. I live in the Athabasca watershed. So the current 200 square kilometers of tailings ponds or lakes are a mixture of residual bitumen, heavy metals, solvents, organic acids. So this has turned out to be a very difficult material to treat by industry. And currently they're not allowed to discharge any of these tailings materials into the Athabasca watershed. Industry is making their proposal to treat and release, as previously mentioned. The latest information we have from industry and their test pilot project shows a process that is still not feasible or acceptable. They've shared their results, and the results show at least 3 heavy metals at high levels still after treatment, a high level of salts, toxic acids, and finally, because of leftover ammonia in the treated material, there's algae and no oxygen. So it'd be frightening to consider that discharge into the river. Now, it's important to note that this potential new source of pollution would add to the industry cumulative impacts of the last 40 years. These ecological impacts are well understood and have been reported in published papers for quite a while. A good example is a series of studies by Dr. David Schindler over 10 years ago. So some of these impacts, such as clear cutting, groundwater pollution, air pollution, toxic dust, have been documented by many scientists. And there are many examples of ongoing impacts on species in the region. Here's just a couple. The local indigenous people have reported and caught fish with tumors. Moose are showing spots and tumors. It's important to note too that region is a huge region, is 54% wetlands, which does hold a higher species diversity than the rest of the land. And finally, just other example I wanted to share before passing on the mic is our regulator showed that just 2 years ago, 20,000 birds have been reported to land on the tailings ponds. The amount that have died due to that, we're not sure, but 2,000 of those 20,000 birds were species of concern. So overall, we're asking for an independent risk assessment of this entire problem, and we feel that the regulators are not doing their job. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Daniel Taselli. I'm Dene. My nation is Kashogotene, and I'm from Fort Good Hope, which is a small Arctic community on the shores of the Mackenzie River. I used to work as a lawyer, but currently I work as chief negotiator for my nation on our self-determination issues. And I also work for Keepers of the Water as their Northwest Territories outreach manager. I want to talk about Canada's legal obligation to Indigenous peoples in relation to this proposed tailings release. Canada now has a legal obligation, and this is a legal requirement under domestic law, to obtain the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous nations that would be impacted by this proposed release of treated tailings. And this is because in June of 2021, Canada's federal government enacted its United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. In that legislation at Section 5, the Government of Canada is required to work with Indigenous peoples to ensure that the laws of Canada are consistent with that UN declaration. Canada's Fisheries Act, under which these proposed regulations would be introduced, is clearly a law of Canada and must be made consistent with that declaration. There's many relevant things in that declaration, but of particular significance are two articles. The first of those is Article 29, which requires states to ensure that no storage or disposal of hazardous materials takes place on the lands or territories of Indigenous peoples without their free, prior, and informed consent. The second relevant article is Article 32, and that requires states to work with Indigenous peoples to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent before approving any project affecting their lands or territories or other resources, particularly in connection with the development, utilization, or exploitation of water. So Canada has signaled multiple times that it does not perceive free, prior, and informed consent as being what it calls a veto on behalf of Indigenous peoples. But they're wrong. That position is not supported by expert analysis of relevant international law. In relation to Article 29 on disposing hazardous waste on Indigenous territories, the former UN Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, S. James Anea, has said that the state is under an obligation to obtain the consent of the Indigenous peoples concerned. In relation to Article 32, the International Law Association's Rights of Indigenous Peoples Committee has said that in cases of large-scale development or investment projects that would have a major impact on Indigenous peoples' territories, consent is necessary. So experts on international human rights law and the rights of Indigenous peoples agree that in cases like this, where the proposed action carries a risk of severe impacts to the territory's waters and associated rights of Indigenous peoples, that consent is mandatory. Canada is absolutely required to obtain the free, prior, and informed consent of all impacted Indigenous nations before enacting Fisheries Act regulations that would legalize the release of toxic tailings into the largest watershed in Canada and the most intact large-scale ecosystem on the continent. And this ecosystem is the broader Mackenzie River Basin. This is a watershed that contains the longest river in Canada and covers 1/5 of the landmass of Canada. It's home to massive amounts of biodiversity and pristine areas of boreal forest. It is the Arctic Amazon. And its tributaries, the headwaters of this watershed includes the Athabasca River, where this proposed dumping of treated tailings would occur. There are also Indigenous nations throughout the entire area of the Mackenzie River Basin. And all those Indigenous nations need to be acknowledged in the application of the legal doctrine of free, prior, and informed consent. A good faith application of that doctrine would consider the potential impacts to the rights of Indigenous peoples throughout the entire watershed. So it would consider the impacts right from the source of that pollution in Alberta to the coast of the Arctic Ocean, where the Mackenzie River empties into. And this is why the Dene Nation addressed this issue of treated tailings release at its National Assembly last summer. So Dene Nation is a political organization that advocates on behalf of over 30 Arctic and subarctic Dene nations and communities. And the chiefs in attendance at the last assembly considered this issue of treated tailings released and passed a resolution that directly opposes the release of treated tar sands tailings into the Mackenzie River Basin, and that also calls on Canada to obtain the free, prior, and informed consent of all downstream Dene before proceeding with proposed fisheries regulations. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. For those of you that joined us a little later, we've been talking about various concerns we have about the oil sands, the tar sands, tailings, ponds, and our serious concerns and opposition with the proposed release. I'll turn it to you if you have any questions for the panel. Yes. Oh, it seems like you have a mic coming your way.
Hi, Amelia Fournier for APTN News. I was wondering, it seems like there's kind of these two parallel narratives where Canada's saying Indigenous sovereignty is necessary. We want to create Indigenous protected and conserved areas. But then when it comes to the high level discussions, Indigenous people aren't represented when it comes to making legislation or even at the UN's creation of their new 2020 framework. The final negotiations don't include you. So I'm wondering what's really necessary to actually include free, prior, and informed consent when it comes to creating regulations and frameworks. And a follow-up to that is that the Alberta economy is very reliant on fossil fuels, and Canada's saying they're going to phase out fossil fuels. So how do you think that conflict's going to play out over the next little while? I know they're big questions, so I apologize. Thank you.
I can attempt that one. Again, Melody with the Mikisew Cree. I would say that we are working with Canada on the development of the regulations for treat and release. But like I noted earlier, that this is being forced upon us as the only viable option. And so our response to Canada in coming forward and saying, work with us to develop these regulations is basically that we refuse that option because it's the only option presented to us. And so we're indicating what are all of the options. Let's weigh out and assess all of the options. There has to be more than one option. We are very concerned about the growth of tailings in the region. We want them removed, but not at the expense of destroying our delta, increasing downstream health concerns and impacts, and infringing on our rights. So we want to examine and address this issue, and we know that timing is of essence. We want these mine sites to be cleaned up and reclaimed to standards acceptable to us. And so there is a rush to create these regulations in just a few years because industry is pushing again as the only option. So how the regulations are going to end up looking like, we don't know. But our approach to development of the regulations is that this option is not the only option, and it is unacceptable at this time.
Perhaps very briefly on your second question on the energy transition and the effect. The Canadian government has promised to enable just transition legislation, which should work on a nation-to-nation basis with Indigenous communities on how they choose to diversify their revenue streams and economy, and we're still waiting on that from the government.
I'll just add maybe two key points that I did say I missed, and that is we are calling for more studies as well. So if there ends up being any type of regulation, we still need to understand how that regulation will impact our rights, our culture, our way of life, and our health. And so it's important for us to make informed decisions to reach free, prior, informed consent. And so there are not a lot of health studies. There are no studies looking at what the potential health impacts are and what the impacts will be to our culture, way of life, and rights. Until we have all of that information, it is really impossible for us to decide and support any type of regulation.
We have time for at least one more question if anybody in the audience. And if not, I wonder if, Tori, you could read another part of what Jean shared with us, reminding that Jean lives in Fort McKay, downstream of the tailings, on the toxicity.
Absolutely. I was just thinking that as well. She travels a lot to speak about water issues and raise awareness about what's happening in her community. And this is a direct quote from Jean on traveling home. On our return home, 10 minutes before we get home, we have to pass 3 tailings ponds. We pass Suncor, and then you feel the stench. You smell the stench. It affects your throat. Your eyes are burning. Some people call it the smell of money. It takes about close to 10 minutes to get from one end of the tailings pond to the other end, driving at 100 kilometers an hour. So now they want to poison our waters further by dumping all of these toxins into the Athabasca River. Athabasca River flows right by my house. Every morning I get up, I open my door, there's the Athabasca River. That's my strength. That's what keeps me going. That was Jean Lomcourt, co-chair for Keepers of the Water.
Melody or Daniel, do you have any final words? And otherwise, we can wrap this up.
Yeah, I have some recommendations. Perhaps in moving forward, I'm just going to read off a briefing provided to me. So we do call upon both Canada and Alberta to continue, or to commit, I should say, not continue, because it hasn't started yet. Commit to work with Mikisew on a review of the tailings management framework as part of their 2022 review of the Lower Athabasca Regional Plan. We ask them to commit to working with Mikisew on reclamation and remediation standards for oil sands. Alberta may not agree, but our intent here should be to outline that Mikisew needs to see reclamation and remediation and make sure that it's documented in a way that would support Alberta in moving forward. We need to implement Athabasca Regional First Nation recommendations on mine financial security program. I mentioned there is less than 3% funding set aside to reclaim the tar sands. Some of the recommendations are filed in that report. We would like to provide, this would at least provide an incentive for operators to manage tailings waste. Full implementation is insisted. Alberta needs to establish a close working relationship with Mikisew and other Indigenous communities that affect us directly, both in the region and downstream. Those are just a summary of a few recommendations. I have many more, but I would just like to, again, reserve for more questions if possible. I think there's one there.
Good morning. My name is Alvin Mantopias. I'm a board member and elder of the Keepers of the Water. And I just wanted to share with you some of our traditional knowledge regarding water. According to the elders, we were instructed to keep the water clean and pure as possible. In the old days, when we traveled upon the land, when we came across a stream or a river, we would offer some tobacco, requesting permission from the spirit of the water to disturb the flow of the water so we can cross over that stream or river. And to us, the water is very sacred. We hold a very close relationship with the water. And still to this day, in the mountains, at the glaciers, we have Cree and Stony elders that go up and all make offerings of tobacco and thanking the water spirit for doing its duty of giving life to all forms of life throughout this land. And we find it very shocking how the water is getting poisoned by industry. And this has to stop, because in our prophecies they say there'll come a time, if this continues, that it'll be very difficult to find clean drinking water to drink. So it's a very urgent issue at this time. So I'd like to thank you. Chimi Guch.
we can join you on the side for questions, but I think we have to wrap this up. Thanks.